August 3, 1943. The sun burned down on Sicily with an unrelenting fury. Inside the 15th Evacuation Hospital tent, the air was thick, heavy, and nearly impossible to breathe. It smelled of iodine, sweat, blood, and fear. The canvas walls offered little protection from the heat outside, and inside, the temperature soared past 100 degrees. Flies buzzed over the wounded, and the faint groans of men in pain echoed against the walls. General George S. Patton walked into the tent like a storm. His polished helmet reflected the dim sunlight, his riding breeches were spotless, and the ivory-handled revolvers at his hip caught the eye of every man present. He had the aura of a god of war. Patton was ambitious, ruthless, and obsessed with glory. He believed in victory above all else, and nothing, and no one, could stand in his way. He moved from cot to cot, stopping to speak with soldiers who had been wounded in battle. He asked questions, nodded approvingly at bravery, and even smiled when a man described how he had held his position under fire. This was the glory he lived for, the courage, the sacrifice, the proof that he commanded heroes. Then he stopped. Patton's eyes fell on a young soldier sitting on a supply box in the corner of the tent. Private Charles H. Cool. The boy looked small, fragile almost, compared to the towering general. He was not wounded. There were no bandages, no blood. He simply sat there, head down, trembling as if the heat itself had robbed him of strength. Patton's shadow fell over him like a thundercloud. The general leaned forward and asked, "Where are you hurt, soldier?" Private Cool didn't look up. His voice was barely audible. I guess I just can't take it, sir. My nerves." Silence fell across the tent. The groans of the wounded faded into nothing. The nurses stopped moving, trays frozen in their hands. Doctors paused mid-stitch. Every pair of eyes turned to the commanding general. Patton's face changed. The calm, controlled commander transformed into something terrifying. Rage, pure and unfiltered, burned in his eyes. He did not see a sick boy. He saw weakness, cowardice, a virus that might infect his army. Without warning, he struck. The sound of the slap echoed like a pistol shot. Private Cool's helmet liner flew off, and he began to cry, the sound high-pitched and panicked. The general grabbed the boy by the collar, hauling him to his feet. His voice cracked as he roared, each word dripping with fury. "I won't have a yellow-bellied bastard sitting here crying. Back to the front lines. And if you don't fight, I'll see to it personally." He shoved the boy down, his hand hovering near the ivory handle of his revolver. For a terrifying moment, everyone in the tent feared he might follow through on his threat. A doctor finally stepped forward, hands trembling, trying to intervene. Patton spun on him, yelling, "Do not admit him. Throw him out. There is no such thing as shell shock. It's an invention of the weak." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Patton stormed out of the tent, kicking aside refuse and dust. The flaps swung closed behind him and the oppressive heat returned. Flies buzzed again, but the silence lingered. The soldiers stared at the trembling boy, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Private Cool was suffering, but not from battle wounds. He had malaria, a fever rising over 102 degrees. Yet at that moment, the true threat came not from the enemy across the battlefield, but from the man who was supposed to lead him. The greatest general in the American army had committed an act no one in that tent could forget. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen men survive bullets, bombs, and fire. But a commander losing control in the very place meant for healing? That was something else entirely. Patton did not pause to reflect. His mind was already on the next soldier, the next victory, the next display of courage. He had driven his men harder than any commander in history, demanding absolute commitment. Rest was weakness. Fear was betrayal. And sitting quietly in the shade of a supply box, Private Cool had drawn the fury of a man possessed by ambition and pride. Outside, the sun continued to blaze down on Sicily, indifferent to the chaos inside the small canvas tent. Inside, the silence lingered like a shadow, a warning that what had just happened was only the start. A storm was building, one that would shake the Allied forces from within, testing loyalty, courage, and the limits of human endurance. Patton walked away, the heat and dust clinging to his uniform, his mind already moving forward to the next battle. But in the corners of that tent, the seeds of tension had been planted. And when they grew, they would threaten not just the men who fought, but the very leadership of the Allied army. For Private Charles Cool, it was a day he would never forget. For Patton, it was just another step toward glory. And for history, it was the beginning of a story that would haunt the generals, soldiers, and nations for years to come. A week had passed since the first incident. The sweltering heat of Sicily had not softened the tension in the Allied army. Inside the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, the air was thick, dusty, and heavy with the smell of sweat, blood, and the fear that clung to every soldier like a second skin. The groans of the wounded, the scraping of stretchers, the faint whine of flies, it was all a soundtrack to exhaustion, suffering, and war. General Georges, Patton arrived once again, polished helmet gleaming, boots clicking against the wooden floorboards, riding breeches pristine despite the dust. His eyes, hard and scanning, looked for courage, for heroism, for the proof that he led men worthy of his glory. He moved from cot to cot, stopping to smile at those who could speak of bravery under fire, offering cigarettes and small words of encouragement, a fatherly figure for a brief moment. Then he stopped. Private Paul G. Bennett, a young soldier who had seen horrors that could break a man, sat huddled on a cot in the back corner. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring into nothing. His hands trembled. He had witnessed the decapitation of his friend by an artillery shell just days before. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had not stopped shaking. His mind had cracked under the relentless pressure of modern industrial warfare. Patton's gaze fell on him. The silence in the hospital was immediate, heavy, oppressive. Nurses froze mid-step, trays held high. Doctors paused, hands poised with instruments. The entire tent seemed to hold its breath. "What's your trouble, son?" Patton asked, his voice deceptively calm. My nerves, sir," Bennett whispered, voice shaking. I can't stand the shelling anymore." Patton's face turned purple with fury. The calm, charming general evaporated in an instant. In its place stood the same uncontrollable rage from a week before. His eyes burned with anger that made the temperature in the tent feel even hotter. "You yellow son of a," Patton began, his hands swinging, and the slap landed. Bennett's head snapped back. He began to cry, small, terrified sobs. Patton's fury only grew. His hand struck again and again, hard enough that the boy's helmet liner flew off. He grabbed Bennett by the throat, shaking him, shouting, each word tearing through the air like gunfire. "I won't have these cowardly bastards hanging around our hospitals. You are going back to the front and you will fight. If not, I'll see it done myself." Doctors stepped forward, trembling, trying to intervene. Nurses gasped. One hospital commander, Colonel Charles Eder, watched in horror, hands shaking. Patton's fury seemed unstoppable. The young soldier, broken and terrified, could not defend himself. He had no choice but to endure the wrath of a man who believed that fear itself was a crime. Patton turned to the medical staff, pointing fingers, shouting, condemning them for allowing what he saw as weakness to fester. "Throw him out. Send him back to the front. There is no room for cowardice here." Then just as suddenly he left. The tent flaps swung closed, leaving behind a boy shivering in the dirt and a room full of stunned witnesses. The silence was heavier than any gunfire. Private Bennett sat on his cot, trembling, feverish, and haunted by the violence that had erupted in the place meant for healing. The doctors whispered among themselves. One remarked quietly, "He isn't sick, he's broken." Another added, "No soldier should ever fear his own general." They knew the truth. Bennett wasn't suffering from weakness. He was shell-shocked. He had been pushed past the limits of human endurance. Malaria and trauma had combined to create a fragile, trembling boy. Outside, Sicily's sun continued to beat down mercilessly. Inside, the storm left by Patton's presence lingered like a shadow, long and dark. Soldiers exchanged worried glances. They knew whispers of what had happened in the 15th Evacuation Hospital had begun circulating. Rumors were spreading. Soon the story would reach ears it was never meant to reach. Patton, for his part, walked away convinced he had done the right thing. In his mind, he was saving the soldiers' souls, forging courage through force, teaching them that fear had no place in the American army. To him, tenderness was weakness. Mercy was failure. And every soldier who trembled under fire was a threat to the mission, to glory, to victory. But history had a way of punishing impulsive anger. What Patton saw as discipline, the army would see as scandal. What he believed was courage-building, others would see as abuse. And at the top of the chain, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, would soon hold the reports that could destroy the career of America's most famous general. Yet in that moment, inside that suffocating tent, no one cared about politics or the war or Eisenhower's decisions. All that mattered was the storm of fury that had just passed through the room. Private Bennett sat alone, trembling and sobbing, a single boy against the unstoppable rage of a man who had never learned compassion for weakness. Outside, Sicily was quiet. But inside the hearts of the men who witnessed it, the memory of the slaps would echo for a long time. Soldiers wondered if courage was worth the price of the wrath of a man like Patton. Doctors and nurses questioned their duty. And somewhere, high above the tent in a cool office, Eisenhower would soon have to decide whether to punish the general, or trust him to win the war despite his brutality. The tent, hot and silent, seemed frozen in time. It was a place of fear now, a crucible where anger, pride, and ambition collided. And as Private Bennett tried to calm his trembling body, no one could know that the events of these few minutes would ripple across the world, influencing the outcome of battles, the morale of soldiers, and the fate of nations. High above the battlefields of Sicily, in a cool, quiet office at Allied headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat behind his polished desk. The sun shone through the tall windows, but inside the air was tense, heavy with responsibility. Hundreds of thousands of men were fighting in scorching heat, under constant fire, and yet Eisenhower's focus was on a piece of paper that could change everything. The reports were in front of him, neatly stacked but heavy with consequence. Officers had written them with trembling hands, recounting what had happened inside the hospital tents. Slapped, thrown out, threats of execution, verbal abuse. The words leapt off the page like daggers. Eisenhower's eyes scanned each line carefully, reading every quote, every witness statement. Yellow-bellied bastard, shoot you myself? The words made him pause. He knew immediately who was responsible. George S. Patton, the fiery, brilliant, uncontrollable general known to the world as Old Blood and Guts. The same man who had stormed through North Africa and now led men in Sicily with unmatched aggression. The same man whose drive had already saved countless lives by defeating the enemy quickly, but whose temper was a ticking bomb. Eisenhower leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He was not just a soldier, he was a diplomat, a leader of a coalition of nations that often hated each other more than they hated the Germans. He had to keep the British satisfied. He had to manage the French, the Americans, the Canadians. And now, in his hands, he held evidence that one of his best generals had violated every rule of discipline in the army. The problem was enormous. Patton was brilliant. He was fast, aggressive, and feared by the enemy. Without him, the Allies might slow down. Hitler's forces could regroup. Sicily, Italy, and eventually France could fall into chaos. But if he did nothing, the scandal could erupt in newspapers, in Congress, in the hearts of mothers across America. How could they trust the army if its leaders abused their own soldiers? Eisenhower took a deep breath. He had a choice. He could court-martial Patton. He could strip him of command and send him home in disgrace. Regulations demanded it. The army expected it. The moral high ground demanded it. Would be easy. Claim. But the war was not easy. Claim. He could not afford to remove Patton from the battlefield. Not now. Not ever. The Germans feared him. The soldiers, despite whispers and fear, needed him. Patton was a weapon, sharp and lethal, and to throw him away would be a gift to Hitler. Eisenhower picked up a pen. He began to write, carefully, each word weighed with precision. Not a public reprimand. Not an official document. A private, personal letter. I am clearly questioning your judgment, he wrote. I do not expect you to be perfect, but I do expect fairness. I understand the need for harshness and tough measures on the battlefield. But brutality and uncontrolled temper are not excused, and they must never be shown to subordinates. It was a masterpiece of leadership. Eisenhower did not shout. He did not punish. He held up a mirror. He reminded Patton of the man he was, the general he could be, and the army he could destroy if he continued down this path. He sent the letter by special courier. Eisenhower did not trust the telegraph. He wanted Patton to hold the paper in his hands, to see the signature, to feel the weight of every word. Meanwhile, in Sicily, Patton was unaware of the storm brewing far above him. He rode through dusty roads inspecting troops, planning his next moves. In his mind, the slapping incidents were already behind him. He believed he had enforced discipline. He believed he had saved the army from weakness. He could not know that, at that very moment, the man in the office above, the calm, calculating Eisenhower, was deciding whether his career would survive or end. The tension was unbearable. Eisenhower's choice was not just about one general. It was about victory or defeat, life or death for thousands of soldiers. One wrong move and the Allies could lose not a battle but a war. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Eisenhower leaned back, eyes on the horizon. He had made his decision. Patton would not be fired. He would be shamed, guided, and contained. The greatest general in America's army would live, but only if he learned restraint. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant artillery and gunfire. The war raged on, unrelenting. Inside Eisenhower's office, time seemed to stretch. A single letter, one sheet of paper, held the fate of a man, a campaign, and perhaps history itself. And somewhere in Sicily, a soldier still trembled on his cot. The first of many moments that would challenge the human spirit, the army, and the moral compass of men who were supposed to lead, protect, and inspire. The stage was set. Patton's fury had been unleashed, the consequences were moving up the chain of command, and Eisenhower, calm and measured, held the final decision in his hands. One letter could save a general, or change the course of the war forever. End of Part 3. Suspense line. And as Patton continued to command without knowing it, Eisenhower's letter was already on its way, a warning that could either save him or destroy him completely. After a tense few days in Sicily, General George S. Patton received Eisenhower's letter. He held the paper in his hands and read it carefully, but the color drained from his face as he realized the weight of its words. For the first time in his life he felt fear, not of bullets, not of tanks, but of irrelevance. Patton had always believed himself to be invincible, a warrior born for glory. But Eisenhower's calm, deliberate words shattered that illusion. The message was clear. His actions in the hospital tents were unacceptable. He had abused soldiers, violated trust, and risked his career. And now he would have to face the consequences, not in court but publicly in front of the very men he commanded. The apology would be humiliating. It was a punishment tailored to wound Patton's pride without removing him from the battlefield. The general, once a fierce lion among men, would now become a humbled actor on a stage he hated. Patton was ordered to appear before his divisions. Thousands of men gathered under the blistering sun, their faces dusty and weary from days of marching, fighting, and surviving artillery fire. Patton stood on a raised platform, his polished boots now dusty and his iconic revolvers absent. For the first time he looked smaller, less commanding. His voice, usually booming and authoritative, was high-pitched, almost squeaky as he spoke into the microphone. He did not apologize for his passion. He tried to explain it. He spoke of his love for his men, of the duty he felt to push them to their limits. He claimed he had tried to slap the cowardice out of them, a statement that left some soldiers confused, some angry, and others silently nodding. Some men cheered. They loved old blood and guts. They understood his drive, his obsession with victory. To them, the slaps were a form of tough love, the mark of a general who demanded excellence. Others remained silent, stony-faced, unsure whether to admire him or resent him. But Patton's punishment did not end on the parade ground. He was sent to the hospitals to personally apologize to the soldiers he had struck. Private Charles Coole and Private Paul Bennett were summoned. Patton found them, shaking and feverish, and extended his hand awkwardly. Words of regret stumbled from his mouth, forced and uncomfortable. He had no natural skill for humility, and the nurses and doctors watched with crossed arms and skeptical eyes. Patton looked like a trapped animal, caged by his own pride. For Patton the experience was agony. He had always believed in action, in the forward motion of war. Now he was forced into stillness, into reflection, into humiliation. He wrote to his wife, Beatrice, admitting, "I had to go and eat crow. It tasted like hell." Yet the apology tour, while humiliating, had a strange effect. It preserved his command and his place in the army. Eisenhower had succeeded in holding a wolf by the ears, taming him just enough to prevent disaster. The general who had nearly destroyed his own career was still the army's most effective weapon, though now tempered by the shadow of accountability. Meanwhile, rumors of the incidents were quietly contained. Eisenhower had arranged for journalists to sit on the story, a secret deal to protect the war effort. The press, the public, and the politicians remained unaware of the full scope of Patton's fury. The general's reputation was bruised, but history had not yet been told. As Sicily fell to the Allies and victory parades were held in dusty towns and liberated villages, Patton returned to his duties with a mix of pride and resentment. He had survived disgrace. He had survived humiliation. But he carried the sting of shame with him, a constant reminder of the fury that could have undone everything he had built. In the quiet moments, when he was alone in his office or walking through the wreckage of war, Patton replayed the incidents in his mind. The sound of the slaps, the trembling of the soldiers, the anger in Eisenhower's words, they haunted him. But they also shaped him. They forced him to consider discipline and leadership in a new light, and, in the end, they allowed him to survive. Yet history was not done with him. Patton's actions had consequences that stretched far beyond Sicily. While he had learned a harsh lesson in humility, the seeds of conflict, tension, and extraordinary military brilliance had already been sown. The stage was set for more drama, more controversy, and more remarkable feats that would define his legend. End of Part 4. Suspense line. The general who had struck soldiers in fury had survived his public humiliation, but the world was about to test him in ways even he could not imagine. After the humiliation of his apology tour, Patton was sent away from the front lines. He was relieved of his command of the 7th Army and placed in what felt like exile, a villa in the quiet countryside of Palermo, Sicily. The roaring general, the unstoppable force who had crushed enemies and driven men to their limits, was suddenly trapped in stillness. For Patton, a man defined by action, this was a torment worse than any battlefield wound. Inside the villa, Patton paced the floorboards. The sun poured through the windows, casting long shadows across the rooms. He tried to write letters, to plan strategies, to occupy his restless mind, but nothing could fill the void left by the absence of command. He was surrounded by quiet officers, aides who whispered behind closed doors, and servants who moved silently as if the house itself feared his rage. Meanwhile, the war moved on without him. Battles raged across Italy, Normandy, and France. Yet Patton's mind was still on the war, on the soldiers he could not lead, on the glory he had been denied. He felt invisible, powerless, a lion in a cage. But Eisenhower had a plan. The Allies knew the Germans feared Patton. His reputation as a brilliant, aggressive, and unpredictable commander made the enemy cautious, hesitant, and often wrong in their strategies. Eisenhower realized that even in exile, Patton could be a weapon, just not in the way he wanted. In England, the Allies created the first United States Army Group, FUSAG, a massive phantom army designed to deceive the Germans. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, empty tents, and dummy aircraft were arranged to make the Germans believe Patton was preparing for a major invasion. Every detail was crafted with precision. Officers and soldiers were in on the secret. Patton himself would act as the commander, a living decoy, while the real invasion plans moved elsewhere. Patton hated it. He despised the charade. He wanted to fight, to move, to lead. Instead, he became a ghost, a figure of fear and legend, trapped behind lines and behind the curtain of deception. Days passed slowly. Patton walked the grounds of his manor, wrote dark, brooding poetry, and drank heavily to dull the frustration that burned inside him. Every step of the fake army reminded him of the action he had been denied, the battles he could not fight, and the men he could not lead. Yet the deception worked brilliantly. The Germans, believing Patton was massing forces in England, kept divisions tied down, waiting for an attack that would never come. They misread Allied plans, delayed reinforcements, and focused on the wrong targets. Patton's enforced inaction became a critical advantage for the Allies. Ironically, the very fury that had almost destroyed his career, the slaps, the shouting, the uncontrolled temper, had contributed to his legend. The Germans feared him. They respected him. And in that fear, the Allies gained time, space, and strategic advantage. Patton's punishment, exile, and the creation of the Ghost Army turned his rage into a weapon without him even leaving his villa. But the psychological toll on Patton was severe. He felt caged, humiliated, and trapped. The man who thrived on movement, violence, and aggression was now a ghost in a house, a spectator to the war he lived to fight. He wrote letters to friends, to his wife Beatrice, to officers in the field, expressing frustration, anger, and despair. He saw the war through maps and reports, but it was not real to him. Action, risk, and decision, the very things that defined him, were denied. And then the moment came. In June 1944, the Allies launched D-Day. The greatest invasion in human history crossed the English Channel. Men died on Omaha Beach, soldiers fought in hedgerows, and the tide of the war began to shift. Patton listened on the radio, frustrated and restless, knowing he was not there. The battlefield he had prepared to storm was filled with blood, sweat, and fire, and he was powerless to influence it. Yet Eisenhower's gamble was about to pay off. The Germans, convinced that Patton was leading the Phantom Army, remained misdirected. They held divisions in the wrong places, delaying reinforcements and creating openings for the real Allied forces. Patton's absence on the battlefield, once a punishment, now became a critical part of Allied strategy. In exile, Patton's legend grew. Soldiers whispered about him, enemies feared him, and the Allies used his reputation as a weapon. The man who had almost lost everything, his career, his honor, his control, was still shaping the course of the war. End of Part 5. Suspense line. Trapped in exile, humiliated yet feared, Patton became a ghost, an invisible weapon whose mere reputation was enough to deceive an entire army. But the war was far from over, and soon, he would return to the battlefield in a way no one could have imagined. August 1944. The frozen exile in England was finally over. General George S. Patton, the man who had been humiliated, shamed, and trapped in a phantom army, was ready to strike again. Eisenhower had decided it was time. The Third Army would become operational and Patton would lead it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to prove himself, to unleash the fury that had been bottled up for months. Patton arrived in France not as a diplomat, not as a penitent general, but as a force of nature. His staff greeted him with both awe and caution. They knew what he could do. They knew his mind worked like a machine, faster than any map, faster than any report. But they also feared the man. Patton had always been unpredictable, aggressive, and unrelenting. Now, after months of being caged, he was dangerous. The battlefield awaited him. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout from Normandy, was stalled. The hedgerows of northern France were a trap. Men were dying slowly. Supplies were strained. The Allies needed speed, violence, and shock, the exact things Patton excelled at. Patton's first orders were shocking to his officers. "We are not holding anything," he roared. "I don't want to see messages about positions held. Let the Hun do that. We advance constantly. We do not dig in. We do not wait. We destroy." Officers exchanged nervous glances. The plan seemed impossible. Supplies were stretched. Roads were muddy. Armor and infantry could be isolated and destroyed. Yet Patton did not care. Logic, caution, and conventional wisdom were meaningless to him. He relied on speed, aggression, and sheer audacity. The breakout began. Patton's tanks roared across France like a thunderstorm. Towns were liberated before his headquarters could even update the maps. Flanks were exposed, supply lines ignored, and communication stretched to the limit. His men followed, exhausted but inspired, swept along by the sheer momentum of his will. The Germans were paralyzed. They had studied Allied tactics, expecting careful, methodical advances. Instead, Patton moved like a whirlwind, unpredictable, fast, and brutal. Entire divisions were encircled and captured. Retreating enemy units were driven into chaos. French villages celebrated, amazed to see tanks roll in so quickly. Patton was unstoppable. Yet Patton's mind was always in motion. He planned 3 days ahead, anticipating German moves, calculating risks that seemed insane to anyone else. Intelligence officers begged him to slow down. "General, your flanks are exposed," they warned. Patton waved them off. "Let the enemy worry about their flanks. I cut their guts out, not mine." By the end of the first month, Patton had liberated more territory than any army in modern history. His Third Army moved with the speed of a storm. The legend of Old Blood and Guts grew even larger. Soldiers who had once whispered about his fury now cheered his name. Mothers who had written letters condemning him now thanked God he led their sons. But Patton's brilliance came with a cost. Men were pushed beyond exhaustion. Supply lines were stretched thin. Some soldiers collapsed from fatigue, while others marveled at their general's relentless pace. Yet Patton believed this was necessary. A long war killed more men than a short, bloody one. Quick, brutal victories saved lives in the end. The climax of Patton's campaign came during the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, the Germans launched a massive, surprise counterattack in the Ardennes. The American lines shattered. Bastogne was surrounded. Panic swept through the Allied command. Eisenhower called a meeting at Verdun. The generals debated, smoked nervously, and worried over logistics. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George," he asked, "how quickly can you strike the Germans in the flank?" Patton's eyes gleamed. 3 divisions, 48 hours, sir." The room laughed nervously. It seemed impossible. Snow, ice, blizzards, and 100 miles of road, no general could turn a mechanized army in 48 hours. But Patton had already planned it. His premonition, his instinct, his genius, they guided every order he gave. And then, like a force of nature, he struck. Tanks raced across icy roads. Infantry followed. Artillery moved with terrifying precision. Within 2 days, Patton's Third Army smashed into the German flank, breaking the siege of Bastogne and shattering the German offensive. The Americans were saved, the Allies held the line, and Patton's brilliance was cemented in history. By the time the snow melted and the war moved forward, Patton had liberated towns, crushed enemy divisions, and inspired an army. The newspapers that had once criticized him for the slapping incidents now reported maps, victories, and unstoppable advances. History had shifted. The man who had been almost destroyed by his own rage had become the savior of Europe. End of Part 6. Suspense line. From exile to unstoppable force, Patton had unleashed a fury no one could match, but the war was not yet over, and the shadows of past mistakes still loomed over him. By early 1945, Georges Patton had proven himself unstoppable. The Third Army had swept across France, shattered German lines, and saved countless lives with speed and aggression. His victories were celebrated, his genius recognized, and his legend cemented. Yet for Patton, glory was never enough. Action was life, and the war had consumed him. Even as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, Patton remained restless. He was a man of motion, and peace, even in victory, felt unbearable. He walked among his officers, inspected tanks, and studied maps with the intensity of a man possessed. He could not rest. He could not slow down. The roar of engines, the smell of burning rubber, the chaos of battle. This was his world. But fate, cruel and ironic, had other plans. On December 9, 1945, a day that seemed ordinary in the quiet ruins of Mannheim, Germany, the man who had survived artillery, tanks, bullets, and frostbite faced the unthinkable: a simple car accident. Patton was in the back of a 1938 Cadillac, riding with his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. They drove slowly through the wrecked streets, past rusted vehicles and shattered buildings. The war was over and the city lay in ruins. Patton, ever restless, shifted in his seat, adjusting his uniform, scanning the destruction with a sharp eye. Then it happened. A young truck driver, distracted or unaware, turned across Patton's path. The collision was not cinematic, it was quiet, sudden, and cruel. Patton's head snapped forward against the glass, then back. Pain exploded through his neck and spine. General Gay called out, shaken. Patton tried to move, but his body betrayed him. He could not. Doctors soon confirmed the worst. Patton had broken his neck and was paralyzed. The man who had walked through fire in Sicily, commanded armies across France, and struck fear into the hearts of the enemy could no longer move. The battlefield that had been his life was now beyond his reach. During 12 agonizing days in the hospital, Patton lay in traction. He could not scream, could not fight, could not act. He stared at the ceiling, thinking of what might have been. Even in defeat, he remained a soldier, a man defined by movement and action. His body was trapped, but his mind roared with the battles he could no longer fight. Patton's death came quietly on December 21, 1945. Fluid filled his lungs and his heart gave out. His last words, whispered to his beloved wife Beatrice, were simple and tragic. "It's too dark. It's too late." The lion of the battlefield, the man who had lived for war, died in stillness, taken not by the enemy but by fate itself. Yet the story of the slapping incidents, of the humiliation, and the exile was not forgotten. Private Charles Cool and Private Paul Bennett, the soldiers at the heart of Patton's fury, had survived the war. Cool returned to Indiana, living quietly, never bitter. Bennett returned to Georgia, honored and silent about the ordeal. The shame of the slaps stayed with them, but they lived to tell the story of a man whose brilliance was inseparable from his madness. History judges Patton in complex ways. He was a bully, a tyrant, and yet a savior. He freed millions, crushed armies, and ended the Holocaust in the regions he conquered. But he was also a man who allowed no weakness, neither in himself nor in his soldiers. Fear, hesitation, or illness were unacceptable in his eyes, sometimes to tragic effect. The war had demanded men like Patton. A man capable of brilliance and brutality, a man unafraid to strike both the enemy and the weak within his own ranks. Eisenhower understood this. He had held the wolf by the ears, tamed him just enough to serve the Allies, and in doing so shaped the course of history. Patton's final legacy is a mix of triumph and tragedy. He was a warrior of unmatched aggression and a genius of movement, yet his life ended in quiet frustration, confined by his own body. The man who had almost been destroyed by a single moment of anger ultimately became indispensable to victory in Europe. And so, the story ends not with a battlefield victory but with reflection. Patton's life reminds us that greatness often walks hand in hand with madness, and that history sometimes needs men who are both brilliant and terrifying. His slaps, his fury, his exile, and his triumphs were all part of a complex journey that shaped the outcome of World War II. End of Part 7. Suspense line. Georges Patton, the unstoppable force of war, may have died quietly, but the echoes of his fury, brilliance, and madness continue to shape history, and remind the world that victory is never simple, and heroes are never perfect.